Welcome to This Week in Web Design. I am your host, Jose Caballero, and this week, Ari Guimon and I are going to do Web Design 102, Intermediate Design Production. I'll be asking him what it takes to manage complexity of web production and the shortcuts to save time and how to stay creative through the whole process. This is episode numero 17, number 17. I'm your host again, co-founder and chief creative officer of digital agency The Group. Every week you ask business, creative, tech, and marketing questions, and we answer them with our guest experts. You can join us live on ustream.tv. You can ask questions live on ustream.tv this weekend, or you can also ask questions on youtube.com/thisweekinlive. On Twitter, you can ask us questions at my Twitter, at Jose Caballero, and seeing it right here below. And you can also use the hashtag TWI Webdesign, TWI Webdesign. One important thing, Facebook. We have about 75 folks. The goal that we set out was 100. We need more.
We need more.
So if you can go to Facebook and like us, and more importantly, not just like us, ask questions. That's where we get all of that's where we get our shows. Some of your questions become what we do on the show. If we can get 100 maybe by the end of the show, that'd be great. That means that 30 of you that are watching live need to come and say like. On YouTube, you can also ask us questions when you watch the show archived. You can leave comments below if you're watching on YouTube now. I go through the comments and I check for questions, and I've answered every single question that's been there. So, come to YouTube when you're watching this and ask questions on YouTube if you're already on YouTube.
It's all about our viewers.
But subscribe on iTunes, and you can also follow us at This Week in Web on Twitter. Subscribe on iTunes. That's really important. Joining our conversation again is guest expert and freelance creative director Ari Guimon. Welcome back, Ari.
Thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I know you're busy and you're working on a lot of stuff. Can you tell our guests a little bit what you're working on right now?
Right now I'm involved with Seth Epstein, who we had a while back. I'm working on his startup, Social Stay. There's also, Hunuku that we're working on. It's a startup
Focus
as well.
project.
Focus CI is starting up. It's the second phase of a project we showed a while back.
Yeah.
And a number of other things here and there.
Good stuff is happening. Thank you again for being here. Web Design 102, Intermediate Design Production, is not only the segment or the show that we had today, but we really wanted to have your questions help mold the show and make it possible. So before we start, I want to give a few shout outs and do a mini sink or swim kind of segment from Twitter. So the first question from Twitter is from Janice Lepins from Latvia. I'm saying hello to, how do you say hello in Latvian? So if our viewers can let us know from Latvia on YouTube, how do you say hello in Latvian? I'll use that next time. He wants to know if his site that he sent us on Behance, which you'll see on your screen in a minute, is Web 3.0, which is a weird question, and if so, why or why not? And we looked at the site. First of all, the site looks great.
The site looks great, yeah.
Zoom in on it a little bit. See
let's do that.
If you can zoom in. So it's a site, it looks like, for a Latvian fire company or a service. But the question is whether this is Web 3.0 or not.
And I think what we were discussing a while back is it's not so much about Web 3.0, if you can even call it that. It's not so much about aesthetics anymore. It's not so much about even the web, It's more about all these things that are happening around mobile devices and social. And so personally for me, from purely an aesthetic point of view, I think this looks, even though it looks great, it looks like something I've already seen. So
it's not the future.
It's not the future.
And Web 3.0. And Web 2.0 was specifically meant to say that, well, there's two implications to it. One is the post-boom, the next phase of web resurgence. And, we really enjoyed the Web 2.0 quote-unquote boom from a amount of work standpoint. But specifically, it's really about the idea that, JavaScript and DHTML.
Right. Ajax, things were happening really on the screen. It wasn't like the old web where you went to each page, like the page had to reload every time you did something. But I think that's actually a really interesting point. Like, actually, Web 2.0 is not so much about an aesthetic either. It's just it happened to have an aesthetic
more physical, gradients, bubbly buttons, big, and a lot of it was driven by Apple's success with the iPhone and all the i products. So Janice, great looking site, great work. You do great work, and people get a chance to view it on Behance. If you send us your work for Sink or Swim, anybody who's watching, you'll get your work featured on the show. So thank you for sending that in. The next question from ND Media Project, and the question is, first time doing a site, and if we can bring up the site on your screen.
Yes.
Again, on Twitter, ND Media Project. He sent this site, and it's called etymology.co.uk, and his question was whether it's good. He would appreciate some feedback. It's his first client site, whether it's good or bad. What do you think, Ari?
First of all, I think it looks great. I personally didn't notice that it was kind of about pets until after I started reading. There are no pets anywhere. I mean, it's just, it looks kind of like, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but like kind of like a Paul Mitchell, or, you know, just kind of like high fashion salon. It doesn't look like very pet, you know, there are no pets here, there are no dogs, you know. And I have to say, from a kind of mechanical standpoint, like I went and I clicked on these color boxes up at the top of the screen. I don't know if we can show that. Which are actually not clickable. I was surprised to find.
Those big, that's just like a graphics banner?
It's just like a graphic. I thought it was a navigation. So, you know, that's something to consider. I mean, I think it would be great if maybe this bar at the top were converted to the navigation. There was some sort of color coding. To me, it felt like this was the primary navigation, and then the actual navigation at the top was kind of like a utility nav. That's kind of what it felt like to me.
So on the graphics level, meaning like just from a design standpoint,
I love how it looks.
It looks nice.
Yeah.
And if you, I took a look at the site. Same comments. It looks nice. Can you go a little deeper? The one comment I had was, how do you get in deeper into the site? Like, what do you click in to start? Like, you have the nav at the top right.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily.
It's not really standing out that
Standing
much.
out in terms of that's what I click on. More products should be surfaced on the homepage. Just have more pictures of those products that you are talking about on the homepage instead of having. And if you look right there, there's like a very little bit of copy. Like if there's a fear of copy. Does that make sense?
There's very little copy, yeah.
And I'm looking at it here, and I'm thinking, could it have used some information architecture or somebody to outline the flow of the users through it? That, I think, is probably the most important thing, to have thought of how the user comes through it.
Right.
So both of these are swims. This one's a swim, and we can put a big swim for it. Thank you for sending us that. And again, send us your sites at Twitter, at Jose Caballero, and we will take a look at them and review them on the show more in depth. And the last question is from Kai Lane, who again is with his class at Queensland, Australia, the Design 221 at University of Sunshine Coast. Thank you guys for watching, and welcome back again if you are watching or when you watch it archived. Really, really glad to have you. And the question was, please talk about workflow from an approved design to boilerplate. So last week we talked about what you have to do to come up with design,
right.
And now you have to talk about, you know, what you do next and how do you go through that entire process, which
right.
is the production process.
Right.
You know, my guys are in a design course, so they are only really dealing with getting working mock-ups together for a developer at this stage.
Right.
So they're just going to, you know, all the mock-ups they need, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Ask us questions. This question came through Facebook. Facebook, it's a great place just to have the dialogue. And again, if you look here below, you have this week, facebook.com/thisweekinwebdesign. That's the direct address. Not only like us, but ask questions that you might have, what you want to see on the show. Put up your work and ask us what things that we can answer about your work, what we think about it. So let's just go right into it, and we're at the 8-minute mark. And answer that first question. What is the first step you take to do this? After you have a cool direction, and
right.
you know, now you have all these templates,
right.
and you have to organize them and all that stuff. What's the first step you take?
I mean, I'd say for me, the first step, once I have like an approved design direction, is to kind of look at the whole. So going back and looking at the sitemap is really important. Understanding maybe what templates you should focus on first versus others. So maybe there are 30 pages on the whole site, but maybe you don't have to design a PSD for every one of those pages, right? Maybe you need to do 10 unique templates, and that's something you need to identify before you start working on, you know, just creating all these PSDs for the developer. Like, what are the actual ones that I need to work on, so you don't end up doing like a bunch of extra work that's not necessary.
So in Web Design 101, in the information architecture episode, we talked about what wireframes look like and what a sitemap looks like, and going back, watching that, and looking at what are the templates that we need to do from that.
Right.
And coming up after this next episode, we're going to start a series where we're going to design a site live during the show and really go through
It's gonna be fun.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
And continue that process of us just doing it versus right now kind of going through it more conceptually. That's Web Design 103, doing it. So the question, or what you said, is look and choose what templates you're going to do. You're not going to do every single template, but you might do between 8 and 25 templates. That's usually an average.
And if you're handing off to a developer, just have a dialogue. Both you guys sit down and just be like, which ones do you need? Do you need me to design every single one? In some cases, they might, but in some cases, they may not.
Let's look at some of the templates, and I want to bring up these 3 rules while you're bringing up some of the templates, and we're going to show a little bit or talk a little bit about savings.com. The first thing, just some basic rules, is understand understand what you're working on, understand the content, understand the site. Understand the wireframes. If you got wireframes, if you made the wireframes, a big issue that we have to deal with is how much of it are you doing? Meaning, are you working in a group, or are you working on your own and you're a freelancer who's working on a project?
I think that's key.
On your own. That's key to distinguish. The second rule is systemize it, and by that we mean, and we'll talk a little bit about that everything should be a system at the beginning versus you kind of going ad hoc all through this process. And we talked about the idea that, or the idea that as a creative, right-brainers, really right-brainers, it's hard to parse all this information or to organize all this stuff in your head, and you have to visualize it, you have to print it out, etc. Do you want to talk a little bit about, well, the third rule is details. And details, and I repeated it there. We repeated it because focus on the details. One of the things that I see, a mistake that I see often happening with young designers is that they look at it as print or they look at it as something else, and knowing that you're making jewelry. Web design is like making jewelry. You have all these tiny things that you have to make, and you have to pay attention to them. That might be difficult, and I've seen it be very difficult for new designers in web design, or for younger designers, or for designers who are not necessarily left-brained enough. Especially designers coming from either broadcast design, where it's very linear narratives that are very fluid, etc. So the idea that you said is look at the system.
Look at the whole.
Look at the whole.
And I think something that you touched on briefly is set the rules at the beginning, right? Don't just jump in there and start designing a bunch of stuff. Just figure out what. So every web page is made up of different components, right? You have body text, you have buttons.
Well, let's show it. Let's actually show it.
There's a website we worked on called savings.com, and this is a design we worked on 2 years ago. Yeah, exactly. And here you can start to look at. I mean, if you look at this
Let's
PSD
break this down. What do you have here? What do you have on this PSD?
So on the PSD, basically, you can see these guides that we have, kind of just limiting the sidebar with the main content area. If you start to look at all the text, so for example, this text here that says deal of the week is a certain font and a certain color, then the same headers that are on the sidebar are kind of the same color, same font, but they're not bolded, right? So it's kind of we set that rule at that point. We said, well, we have headers that are part of the main content area are going to be this font, they're going to be bold. And
can you turn them on and off? Turn the headers that you're talking about?
Absolutely.
So you're talking about basically systemization. Deal of the week is going to be the same as staff picks, is going to be the same as...
Exactly, because these are both headers, the main headers that are on the main content area. But then those same ones that we have on the sidebar are a little bit receding, so they're not as prominent.
So one thing real quick we do for this is to create a style guide or create all of the fonts are going to be this size, all the headers. It's similar to doing CSS,
I think that's key.
Doing it as a visual.
I think that's key. And we've worked with developers who actually do that in HTML very simply. They just lay out all the types of headers you're going to have, all the types of text, all the types of buttons, and they just style them. So basically you have the whole kit ready to go before you even, exactly.
So again, I want to make it really tangible and make it easy to understand.
Right.
So the question is about workflow.
Right.
So the first step, going back to Web Design 101 and having having the schematics and knowing what all the sections are, the heuristic or to use big words there, the content kind of structurally, and then and in addition to that, what the nomenclature, what the words are for all of that. You have that, you show it to the client, they check off on it, and they're like, great. You move on to the next level, which is page level, and you begin either wireframing that in black and white, which we showed on Web Design 101, and now you get that, and then you get the design direction, which we showed in the previous episode last week, and now you move on to the actual design or production, which is what we're doing now.
Yes.
So talking about production and going to the next question, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do. So I'll frame it this way. When I started as a designer, one of the things that really kind of overwhelmed me was that if I had to choose 15 templates or 20 templates, I had to do 20 templates. That's a lot of work and a lot of stuff to keep track of.
Right.
What are things that I can do as a designer that will help me really keep track of that? And can you show us your files? How did you set up a file? Just walk us through your process. Now you have wireframes, you're creating savings.com pages, go.
Right. I mean, I would say, like, for one, you have one PSD per page. That's an important thing. Don't design all your pages in the same PSD. That's one thing. Another one, I would say, try to follow through with the naming convention. So if you, for example, are working by yourself and you went through an information architecture process with the client, you used a certain naming convention, follow through with that naming convention when you're showing them PSDs. Don't call the wireframe something and then you kind of switch.
Can you show us your naming convention on your files on your desktop?
Absolutely. Like if you look at
that folder.
Yeah, if you look at this folder from savings.com, like I pulled some of the templates that we worked on, but you can see for the most part they have SDC at the beginning, so where they're jumbled up with a bunch of other files, you can automatically group these because they're all from the same project, SDC meaning savings.com. Then you have the page name right after it, so you know there's a blog post error page, home page, a stores page, and then immediately after that, you know, just the date, month, day, year format, and then after that, the initials of the person that worked on it last, which I think is kind of important. Just so, and this only applies like if you're working in a team with other designers or you're throwing files back and forth, or even when you hand it off to a developer and they have a question about the file, they can know who the last person to work on that file was.
But it applies to even if you're working on your own. One of the things that, so again, you're working in a group or you're working on your own, one of the things I do right at the beginning is having the naming convention and also having my folder convention or how my systemize it. That's the second rule, systemize it. Because if you don't systemize it, you're going to get lost, you're going to get confused. It's 4 in the morning and you're like, oh crap, and you start doing it quickly and like not saving files.
It'll help you manage complexity. I guess that's the whole point. There's so many things, so many variables that you're dealing with that if you set the rules at the beginning, be it, you know, what things look like or the spacing between things, what they're called, once you get like 20, 30 pages in, if you followed these rules, it's ultimately going to help you out as a designer when you're like working late, you know, and you can't make sense of things. Like the more you follow these rules, the more like you will be able to manage all this information.
So again, my experience has always been that for me to manage all the ADD and to manage all these things that I have to work on, the only way that I could do it is if I systemize it as tight as possible. So the naming convention that you're using is name of the project, the page, the date, and a version number.
Right.
That's it. Great. And can you walk us through a file, how the layers, again, are set up? Just take a little bit of time. Here's how I did the file. Here's what the structure is.
Absolutely. And this is actually an interesting file because we worked on versions of some of these content modules after we handed it off. So, for example, you can see that all of the modules, for example, featured stores.
Can you zoom in on that?
Or
like I want you to show the layers itself, how they're organized.
So here are our layers. And you can see there are multiple versions of this feedback module. So what happened was we handed off the file, and then the client came back and said, you know, I want to see multiple versions of this module with different text color, whatever. So that's what you're looking at right here. There are several versions of that feedback module. There's only one that's visible, which was the final one that was selected. And this was kind of a file that is a bit of a work in progress. Here, you know, feature stores, submit a deal, staff picks. All of these layer sets correspond to, for example, so let me just zoom out so I can actually select something. Featured stores, there it goes. There's that whole module, featured stores. It's inside of one layer set. And that's the way, that's kind of what I'm doing all the way up and down the page, right? All of the little bits of content on the page are inside of its own layer set. And you know, ultimately you can organize it the way you feel more comfortable with, right? Like if you want to do header, content area, sidebar, footer, that's totally fine. If you want to break it out by modules, it really depends on the project and what you're more comfortable with.
One of the things that the class asks, or that I'm taking from their question, is that they're designing for developers, so they have to hand it off to developers. In Savings.com, we had an internal development team, or a team. It wasn't handing it off to a development partner to someone else.
Right.
And interestingly enough, you know, Fun.com was similar in that no, it was similar. It wasn't similar. It was dissimilar in that we were handing it off to a financial development company, and I remember the comment from the client was, "Wow, that's the best deliverable that we've ever had."
That was
because you have to do style guides, you have to do all these things, and it's going back to systems because I think that. You don't have to be that rigid. It's not that you have to be really robotic, about it. Is that you have to do things with logical sense. I get a lot of young designers coming out of school who begin designing, who either bring their bad habits from school of just kind of having all these files all over the place, et cetera, and not being able to track the stuff, and then going into web. You have whatever systems you didn't put in place at the beginning, or whatever messiness you have at a small scale when you're doing the site, it just blows up exponentially. It
multiplies once you have like 20 pages or 30 pages, it just, when you're dealing with one page,
it's fine.
It's fine, right.
Yeah, and if you're in a hurry, well, one interesting observation to that is that print design programs like InDesign, they do that for you. Because everything is you're seeing it visually here. For web design, there's all separate PSDs, and then there's all separate HTML files. Even though there are, in a WYSIWYG editor, you can look at the overview, or in something like Squarespace, you can look at an overview of what all your pages are, or an index view of it. That's still not visual enough. Okay, so let's talk about creative. We're talking about the workflow, and talk a little bit about how to stay creative within this, and what do you do in order to, because it's very system. Show me the designs and talk about what were the things that you did in order to come up with that, and not, you have to do a lot of templates, you have to come up with a lot of metaphors. Like spend the next 3 minutes going through 5 of the screens and just explain a little bit what it went through.
Right, so I think that's something...
Or 3 of the screens, a minute per screen.
Right, I mean, I think the first thing to note is that the metaphor that we used was physical metaphors of organization.
So show another page from this one. Show the profile page, for example. The profile page, what's interesting about the profile page is that it really begins to make some metaphors, but still keeping it simple. And if we begin looking through the different pages or the different, how do you stay fresh in the metaphors and while you have to organize all of it?
I think something that helps me a lot is having project boards. So what does that mean? So that's kind of like, exactly, like take it out of the screen, print everything out. I think for me personally, it's really helpful to view everything at once. So to have all of the designs that I've done so far printed, you can notice inconsistencies between the pages, etc. If you have your designs and you have like the references next to it, as you're looking at the wireframes, you can say, well, I have a little sub-navigation, for example, here, right? So instead of doing something, just bare bones, kind of like default in some text, you can say, well, why don't we use one of these little kind of label stickers, and maybe have like a highlight, like if a pen drew it or something. And I think that comes from like understanding the whole, having all your references handy, and taking it out of the computer, and just putting it somewhere where you can view it.
Well, you reference a real sticker there, like you went and got a sticker and did that. Go back to that page. I want to see something and ask you about and again, going through the different pages, there is an underlying system, meaning that the fonts are consistent, that the visual language of buttons are consistent, and that goes to, this one is one that I want to show. Zoom in on this one. One thing, again, and going back to the class in Queensland, that to urge you, pixel measurement, the details, I call it jewelry making. So the distance between the header and that form and that field is, I can see from here that it's 5 pixels.
Right.
The distance between, the end of a form to the next, might be, 10 pixels or 8
Again,
pixels.
it goes back to what we were saying of setting the rules up at the beginning, right? And then following through all the way with your 20, with 30, 40 pages, whatever. When you look at all of them as a whole and you notice that the spacing between, for example, a header and some text is always the same, that's what really makes things look tight.
I see, and I see a lot of, I get to see a lot of, well, I get to see student work, and recently I was at Art Center and Art Center College of Design here in Pasadena, and they have a show at the end of each semester, and they show a lot of the work. And I was very impressed with how tight a lot of the work was. In school, you don't necessarily do a whole site. Sometimes you do, and you build them. And knowing how HTML is built and CSS does help, but if you're a good print designer, and we said that last week when we talked about the interns, the question was what makes a good intern? And I said typography, because I know So I have a question here. Ask Ari how big screen he is working on in designs. I have a 20-inch iMac, or a 20-inch iMac, but I want to buy an extra LCD monitor. So how big should you have an extra monitor?
Personally, I don't like working with an extra monitor because it doesn't map to the Wacom tablet. I like to have just one big monitor, but that's just a personal preference. I would say the size I'm comfortable with is the intermediate size of the Apple.
Not 30 inches.
Not the ginormous one, right? Like kind of like the middle ground, and just.
Is there a reason for that?
The big one just seems like, whoa, just
daunting.
Too much, and then it like so much space mapping to this little bit of area here. It makes like when you move, the thing just kind of like flies.
So it's an issue that you like working with the Wacom. So it's almost like a 1-to-1 proportion.
It's a 1-to-1 proportion
to what you're looking on the screen.
Exactly.
I've kind of transferred over to executive, so I am, or meaning I don't design as often, but when I do, I like having a monitor, an intermediate size monitor. I do like having a really big monitor. That's kind of nice because you're gonna have a lot of stuff open.
Yes.
What I don't like about that is that you get distracted. So you have,
That's true.
Pandora. You're watching This Week in Startups over here. You're watching this other thing over here, and it just becomes too messy. So I like containing. But so if does that answer your question, or hopefully that answers your question. And thank you again for tuning in, and great job on the site that you shared with us earlier. One of the things, and kind of to begin, a lot of the things, it's hard to work on 20-inch monitors if you need to work on many layouts at the same time, drag and drop. So what we do, Janice, is, I think the name is pronounced not Janice, but Janice, is we print them out and we see a lot of the layouts. That's one of the key things that we do.
Right.
I understand Web 3.0 powers that you can make things with CS3, which was CSS3. What images was images in Web 2.0, and of course HTML5 is a Flash killer. So Web 3.0 being about HTML5, being about less Flash, being about CSS3, those are all true. Right. Those are all the technological factors of what, again, Web 3.0 is a bucket of what's next. Right. In a way, we're kind of at the tail end of Web 2.0, so that's another tweet.
I think that's
actually, it's not Latvia, it's Sveltsky, it's hello, Sveltsky. Need to get a big sign that says Sveltsky. Thank you for that, appreciate that. So we're at the 27-minute mark. Let's recap the rules. Let's bring up the rules again. Number one, the first rule is understanding what you're doing.
Understand the content that you're working with.
I seriously hate when designers use lorem ipsum.
Right.
Now, you have to use it because if you have a lot of body copy.
Right.
Or where you don't specify a header and you just call it header.
Right.
Or, the one story that I can say in 1 minute is when I was at Razorfish, I was pitching the Time Warner cable show. And I'll tell you the story directly to you. Just very simple. I was pitching the Time Warner Roadrunner, the new cable service by Time Warner here in the US. And we were giving some of the specs or kind of a sketch from the client, and we're pitching against the top 3 firms in New York, interactive firms. And I spent 3 days, didn't sleep, did the whole thing myself, programmed it in Director so that it was a click-through. But I watched CNN. I looked at all the properties since it's a portal, and I put real content. Not only that, I went back the night before the presentation, and I put content from that morning, and I changed all the content's time code to the time of the meeting. So and I didn't know this at the time, but the best way to sell something is if it's as close to what their experience is going to be. So that's why you get demos, or that's why you get a test drive at a car dealership. And guess what? We got the pitch, and it was a multi-million-dollar pitch for Razorfish. I had just given my resignation at that time, and it ended up being that I left, and they asked me to come back to finish that project, and I ended up staying. But the point is that the content, the realer it is, the better. But the designers say, well, I'm not the writer, I'm not the information architect, why should I do that?
It'll help you.
It'll help you. And when we talked about this before, design the content, don't design the frame.
Absolutely.
If you design the frame and you whittle, what if you run out of time? You got to show the client what?
It's all about the content, and we said it on the way over here. It's kind of like having a big fancy book, but all the pages are blank, but it's got an awesome cover. Nobody's going to read that book.
If you're a web designer, you design web pages, your job is to design the content, right? And therefore, you have to deal with it. Avoiding it or not dealing with the content makes no sense. So really dealing with the content. So the second rule is really, again, systemization. It's logic. It's like make things, so that you can repeat it over and over in the process.
Right.
And the third rule is the details. I personally am not the most detail-oriented person, and I actually kudos because not only can you do a ton of work, consistently, but also really keep the details. And
that's actually a really good point. And a quick something I want to say really quickly is when I first started designing this, I didn't have a lot of experience in web. I used to try to design
when you first started designing in general for web?
For web, right. I used to try to design from the outside in because I thought for less effort I can make a bigger impact by putting the logo up there with a nice background, not really paying too much attention to the actual content of the page. And that's something that over the years I've kind of understood that it's better to design from the inside out. Like start by understanding what content is on the page and by focusing on that.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And we need to wrap up. And talking about that, one of the things that we did this weekend is we had the first group school. And I want to thank everyone who came. I want to thank Ron, and his Twitter username is Ron9WG, who came all the way from Las Vegas to come. And we put the picture up of the workshop. The feedback was immense. We had a lot of fun. People actually, and that's a good use of the word actually, did the exercises in the class from the different things that we have in the workflow and in the process. And starting not the next episode, but the next episode after that, episode 18, we're going to design a site live on air, just like we do it in the workshops, and have you have the opportunity to follow along with us and design the same site with us and see what we're doing. Now, the cool thing there is that it's with a real client, and the client's going to be here, so it's going to be really interesting. For next week, we're going to continue the Web Design 102 series, and we're going to do the intermediate development portion, and we're going to finish doing the install of WordPress, and we're going to talk about how to work with developers. You know, what are the challenges of, you know, as a designer? It's from the designer's point of view, and also some of the key things from the developer's point of view on how to interact. So we'll be complete with the 101, 102, and the series after that we're going to do 103, and for the next X amount of weeks we're going to work together with all of us together on working on designing a site. Join us next week. We're looking forward to seeing you. Have a great day. Ask questions.